Humankind cannot gain anything without first giving something in return. To obtain, something of equal value must be lost. That is alchemy's first law of equivalent exchange. In those days, we really believed that to be the world's one and only truth. Fullmetal Alchemist is a series that I, and I'm sure many others, am extremely fond of. It's one of my most formative experiences with anime and manga, and though I've never disclaimed it on my channel before, it should come as no surprise that it is the crowning champion of my coveted favorite story of all time title. Nothing has drawn me in, sunk its teeth into me, and made me remember it more than FMA. And I think a lot of people feel similarly, whether it's their true favorite or not. But Fullmetal is getting on in years now. The first anime adaptation was almost 20 years ago now, and the manga has been over for a little over 11. Its critically acclaimed and dearly loved second television adaptation ended the same year the manga did, so despite its still pretty stunning visuals, it too is getting to be more classic than it is modern. In the world of more streaming services than you can shake a stick at and a slew of seasonal anime coming out left and right, it can be a little difficult to convince people to go back and have a look at what us old fogies would call the essentials. And truth be told, I don't really want to be making a why you should watch/read FMA type video in this scenario, so I probably wouldn't be the best person to turn to for that kind of proselytizing. Instead, I wanted to come at this from another angle, explaining why and how, despite its finite shelf life, that FMA has managed to echo on and find a consistent place at the table of anime discussion where many of its contemporaries fall short of finding a seat. What exactly is it that inspires the kind of popularity necessary to not only have a successful manga run, but two successful television runs within the same decade as each other? Not to mention countless video games, spin-offs, OVAs, and a few theatrical films of varying quality. Well, that's exactly what I want to talk about here today. This isn't so much a recommendation or a review, and trust me, this isn't going to devolve into one of those opinion pieces over which anime I think is objectively better or some nonsense like that. Rather, this is a study, let's call it. An attempt to immerse ourselves in everything this franchise has to offer, the time it originally hit Western shores, its lasting impact on anime fandom, and why its overtones and themes hit us so darn hard 20 years down the line. We'll also be examining the tonal differences between adaptations and how the same essential starting framework, Hiromu Arakawa's original manga, could inspire two very similarly structured stories with subtle and poignant differences in how they view a myriad of different issues. This one's gonna have a lot to talk about, and though I will attempt to make this as entertaining a romp as I can for those who haven't seen any iteration of this series, I will disclaim that this video is going to spoil this series rotten, and I can't in good conscience recommend you to spoil yourself on any version of FMA if you've never seen it before. In fact, if you've never seen it before, I envy you, because I would kill to find something that made me feel the same way FMA did the first go around. But that being said, you have been warned now, so if you still decide to stick around, I'll do my best to entertain you even so, but just know what you're getting yourself into. And without further ado, my name's Marcy, and this is why we love Fullmetal Alchemist. For those joining us after this intro that aren't familiar with FMA but decided to stay anyway, as always, I suppose a brief history lesson is in order. Fullmetal Alchemist started as a manga series written and illustrated by Hiromu Arakawa, starting in July of 2001 in monthly Shonen Gangan, and ending in June of 2010 with a total of 27 volumes in all. The world is basically steampunk, and it takes a lot of aesthetic cues from Industrial Revolution-era Europe. The time is the 20th century, but in this universe, alchemy is a widely practiced science that is basically like cool magic. It operates under a principle commonly referred to as equivalent exchange, where something can be transmuted out of something with the same properties and mass, meaning you can't just create a cool diamond sword out of dirt, you'd need the actual materials necessary to put it together. The central protagonists are older brother Edward Elric, a brash hothead with smarts and alchemic talent who can become agitated and fired up rather easily, and his younger brother Alphonse Elric, who is more of a gentle soul who serves mainly as a grounding force to keep his older sibling from getting into more trouble than he already is. In the world of FMA, the one forbidden act of alchemy is attempting to transmute a live human, as even with the materials necessary to compose a human form, the value of a human soul is almost insurmountable. As naive children, Ed and Al suppose that they have enough raw talent as alchemists to resurrect their dead mother, but when attempting to do so, it of course goes horribly wrong. Ed loses a leg and Alphonse his entire body in the process. In a quick bid to save his brother's life, Ed additionally sacrifices an arm to bond Alphonse's soul to a nearby suit of armor, thus rendering him alive, but as a lumbering giant husk that cannot eat, sleep, or even feel the touch of something. The creature they end up putting together isn't even their mother, and instead a barely living abomination of a creature that hardly even resembles a human. Edward receives metal prosthetic limbs called Automail from the neighboring Pinako Rockbelt and her granddaughter Winry, and sets out with Al with determination to restore both of their bodies to their original states and right their wrongs in the process. To do this, the brothers seek a mystical artifact of alchemic legend known as the Philosopher's Stone, which is said to grant the user unlimited transmutation ability, enough to even surpass the laws of equivalency themselves. With this, we've already got a really engaging premise, and we already feel enough empathy for the brothers themselves to want to see them succeed. Considering the trajectory of the story will directly coincide with their efforts to do so, this works wonders in getting viewers invested right away. However, where the story goes from here really depends on the medium you're dealing with. Yes, if you've come here aware that there are 2 anime adaptations for this series, but unsure exactly of why, then this is the part where I've got to explain that. The manga, as previously stated, ran from 2001 to 2010 with 27 volumes and 108 chapters. The first animated adaptation of the series arrived from Bones Studio in 2003 with an anime simply titled, of course, Fullmetal Alchemist. The series began in October of 2003, airing for a total of 51 episodes, concluding in October of 2004. Seeing as the manga wouldn't end for another 6 years from this point, you can imagine that the manga's plot is not represented faithfully here, and indeed you'd be right. The first half of the 2003 anime loosely adapts the first 7 volumes of the manga, however that's not to say the changes only become obvious at this point. The structural changes are numerous in the beginning, adding much original content to basically set the tone for the kinds of encounters the Elric brothers will find themselves in, the questions they'll have to deal with, and moreover setting a precedent for the kind of early career Edward has as a state alchemist. An alchemist who basically makes research money from the government and free rein to pursue their particular research interests in exchange for being for hire military weapons able to be summoned for armed conflict. The major changes in relevant plot details start to appear in the anime around material contained within as early as Volume 3 of the manga. And may I remind you, this ended up being a 27-volume series, so the amount of material the anime staff had to work with when deciding to craft their own complete and original story was, to put it bluntly, not much. They had a popular property on their hands and a demand for television, but the material simply wasn't abundant enough to keep it going unless they either paced it in yearly seasons, something much more uncommon at the time than it is now, or what they actually ended up doing, which was deciding to make the world and story wholly their own, taking it in a completely different direction than what the original author would herself ultimately create. An original film titled Conqueror of Shambhala, which acts as an extended conclusion to this anime original story, was released in 2005, and only 4 years after that we got Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Brotherhood is a subtitle we Western folk came up with because the way it's actually distinguished from the original anime in Japan is by... okay, get this. So, the original anime was just called Hagane no Ren Kinjutsushi, just like the manga is, and it basically means Alchemist of Steel in its literal translation, but Fullmetal Alchemist was always the official English title, even in its Japanese releases, as it features an English text alongside the Japanese series title all the time. So, to make people clear on the fact that the new anime was not, in fact, the 2003 series, they titled it Hagane no Ren Kinjutsushi Fullmetal Alchemist, which to us English English speakers would basically just be Fullmetal Alchemist, Fullmetal Alchemist, which, yeah, that's kind of goofy, but to be clear, I am going to be a pedantic little bitch about the fact that I think Brotherhood is a lame subtitle, so to distinguish between the two anime as I talk about them, I'm going to refer to the original adaptation as FMA 2003 and the second as FMA 2009, respectively. As one would guess, FMA 2009 is more of a true-to-form straight adaptation of Hiromu Arakawa's original manga. No original storylines, except for the first episode, and basically adhering to her creative vision for the story the entire way through to where the manga itself ends. 2009 is extremely beloved and often touted as the definitive FMA, which of course boils the blood of those who actually prefer the 2003 version, and this has resulted in a lot of unending mudslinging from hardcore defenders of either adaptation, determined to prove their opposite camp that the other version is dog shit.
Whoa now, there's no need to fight here. Someone might get hurt, you know.
I think this is really stupid, to be honest. Both versions of the story have their individual merits, and while people are certainly entitled to their opinions, the snobbery on either side of the line here is just completely unnecessary. Who cares if someone prefers the version you don't? Just be glad that we all like Fullmetal Alchemist over here, why don't ya? And speaking of liking Fullmetal Alchemist, it might be high time to explore the appeal of the original manga and a little bit of its history before we dive deeper into the individual anime adaptations and their themes and how they're handled. The author is one Hiromu Arakawa, born on May 8th of 1973 in Hokkaido, Japan. She was born and raised on a dairy farm with 4 siblings and has been drawing since she was little, always curious about the path of a manga artist. After graduating high school, she created doujinshi with her friends and ended up moving from her rural setting to Tokyo in the summer of 1999. She worked as an assistant to Hiroyuki Eto, author of Mahojin Guru Guru at Square Enix, and she published a one-shot titled Stray Dog in the Gangan magazine the same year. In July of 2001, Arakawa finally published the first chapter of Fullmetal Alchemist in the same magazine, with her new series Silver Spoon beginning in 2011 running until 2019. She also draws the manga adaptation of Yoshiki Tanaka's The Heroic Legend of Arslan, so suffice it to say, FMA set her up for a pretty esteemed career. But of course, FMA is always to be remembered as her magnum opus, so let's crack it open. What immediately strikes me about Arakawa's artistic ability is in her ability to contrast. Her art is almost somewhat round and friendly looking at a casual glance, and this makes FMA pretty easy on the eyes for the most part. This is of course juxtaposed brilliantly with devices, settings, or situations more immaculately detailed, often in a striking or even frightening fashion. Take, for example, the amount of detail that goes into something like Ed's automail, especially when it is shattered in his fight against Scar. This panel is gorgeous, but not only is it visually enticing, it also does a very good job of portraying the weight of the moment, as well as its emotion. Arakawa isn't the strongest composer of manga I've ever seen. While her paneling work is absolutely serviceable, there's not a lot of strong contenders for extremely creative paneling work that I would say catches my eye like others have. But her strength undoubtedly lies in her ability to convey emotion, both in a scene and within a character. And considering that while littered with action, FMA leads us tantalizingly through repeated moral quandaries and harsh circumstances that are meant to get us thinking about those things, it's important to ensure that your reader is able to emotionally connect with what's going on. Expressions are a big part of this, and while not immaculately detailed, Arakawa has a way of depicting the face in just such a way that feels like the perfect amount of specific emotional nuance is provided. You really get a sense for how these characters feel just by looking at them. And speaking of the perfect amount, another strength of the manga is that almost nothing feels wasted. What I mean by that is that there are plenty of series where the plot meanders for so long sometimes that it starts to become rather cumbersome, leading you to ask something like, why is this here? What is the point of this scene? And I fail to find many, if any, examples of that in FMA.
漫画の描き方というものを意識しだしたのが多分うるせえやつらからね。すごい無駄がないんですよね。大人になってから読み返してみたらこれは恐ろしい漫画だと思って。
Now, to be clear here, though, I am making a distinction between something necessary for a story and what might be considered necessary to the plot, because, believe it or not, these are different things. Focusing on only the plot can make a series feel dry or repetitive or just disorienting to read. A good plot can only be as strong as the author's writing. Meanwhile, there can be many incidental details that contribute to the overall cumulative picture of a story's world, characters, or setting that assist and aid the plot in constructive ways, which make it feel more whole, and that's what I'm referring to with FMA here. It doesn't waste your time. If it's showing you something, it's important, whether it be for plot reasons or for emotional reasons, because emotion is a large and driving force of the series at large. You might have guessed this from the earlier plot synopsis, but FMA is pretty tragic in a lot of places, and it can be equally horrifying while also being heartrending. This is a story, no matter the form you view it in, that has a lot to say about human cruelty, war, death, and the nature of even being human in the first place. Consequently, though the tone is somewhat livened by its occasional slapstick comedy and endearing and multifaceted cast of characters, each with their own allegiances, goals, beliefs, and agendas, this levity never compromises the weight of its subject matter, making it feel very grounded in a way, like trying to make little jokes with your friends to distract from the world burning around you. But hey, it can be a little easy to get lost in the weeds here when we've begun to talk thematic appeal, and because contrast in this regard will feature heavily in how I talk about the respective television adaptations, this is probably as good a time as any to start talking about them. I will be speaking primarily of the 2003 series at first because of its release chronologically, but I'll be talking about 2009 and consequently the story of the manga more as we go on. I'll be denoting a lot of topics for a specific series by using footage from either appropriately, so the aspect ratio of the footage will be a good way to tell them apart, provided I'm not talking about Conqueror of Shambhala. Though if I'm very specifically hitting on something that I think only pertains to one or the other, I'll be making that more clear in my actual words. The 2003 anime is how most English-speaking anime fans ever first heard the name Fullmetal Alchemist to begin with. It was directed by Seiji Mizushima and was licensed for English distribution and dubbing by Funimation Entertainment in 2004, debuting on Adult Swim on November 6th of that year. In the early 2000s, anime was not nearly as big in America as it is now, with every scrap of content we received ultimately being on the table at some point. Whether you were sneaking to watch Adult Swim past your bedtime, or binging a show's backlog in 5 parts per episode and 240p quality on old school YouTube. The fact remains that the pool for entertainment in this niche was, to put it bluntly, small. Kids and teens were expected to get their fix primarily by way of things like Pokemon and Dragon Ball Z, and those looking for home video releases of a more mature nature would more than likely stumble headlong into something a bit more thoughtful or even psychedelic like Akira Evangelion or Serial Experiments Lane. For the edgy teens of us that wanted a bit more thought and care in tandem with our action, the arrival of Fullmetal Alchemist was like an answer to our prayers. It had a fantastic and immersive world similar to the death-defying martial arts of Dragon Ball, but in a bit more of a grounded manner, and its story, while still packed to the brim with action, still featured very thoughtful protagonists exploring complex moral quandaries and exceedingly dark circumstances. And when I say dark, oh boy, do I mean dark. Both iterations of this series obviously have plenty of nightmare fuel and tragedy to go around, but 2003 revels in the kind of emotional futility it can only make you experience when dropping something awful right at your doorstep and watching as your stomach lurches in real time. This can obviously be seen in the story's themes of military conflict, which is, of course, a large theme in both stories, but is nevertheless incredibly important here. Edward works for the state military of Amestris in order to pursue his alchemic research, but the military is pretty ironclad, and they've got a big thing about being questioned by anyone, and they're incredibly uniform, and always tout their strength, and their leader is called what? Yeah, okay, so they're basically fascists, but far be it from me to allow you to walk away mistakenly under the impression that our heroes are too. Far from it. Ed and Al constantly disapprove of the military's actions and even intervene with them on multiple occasions, never quite playing by the rules, but always by their own code. What the story does want to talk about, though, is the sort of banal and almost innocuous-seeming quality of cruelty that is even given voice in large-scale military conflicts, particularly of the fasci variety, but also in and of themselves. You see, it can be kind of hard to reckon with, but the fact remains that regardless of the intensity of an awful deed committed by any one person or group of people, no matter the size, there rarely exists a concentrated form of evil the way we might think of it. Evil as an all-encompassing bad guy who perpetuates cruelty and destruction for purely its own sake is well, basically a fantasy. It's a stand-in of the Saturday morning cartoon variety that we don't really have the privilege of confronting in real life. Of course, there are still plenty of people out there who do cartoonishly evil things, but the point isn't that their actions are good, it's that they usually think their actions are good. Which is to say, nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, I'm gonna do so much evil. I'm gonna make as many people suffer as possible. Everybody thinks they're the protagonist of their own story, and when you combine that with political tensions, rhetoric, and propaganda, it becomes frighteningly apparent why some of the most horrific things in all of history were perpetuated by the kind of people who might seem completely normal to the casual observer. FMA is completely self-aware of this, and plays into it hard with the state alchemists and their role in the Ishvalan Civil War, a conflict which broke out when, after a prolonged period of political tension between the alchemy-abhorring Ishvalan citizens and the alchemically and militarily controlled state, an Ishvalan child is shot by an Amestrian soldier, leading to a full-scale uprising which ultimately ended with the Führer commanding all Ishvalan citizens to be exterminated. Some of the friendly and familiar faces we follow within the ranks of the military throughout the series were involved with Ishval, and the contrast becomes extremely dire once we find out what exactly they've been so tortured over. Whether they were simply following orders or were tricked about the reasons for the war itself, the fact remains that they did do some indescribably evil things.
I'll tell you what I don't get. Did you people expect something different? You act like you're surprised, like you didn't choose this. Look straight at the people you kill. Don't take your eyes off them for a second. And don't ever forget them, because I promise that they won't forget you.
And the lingering question of what to do with them, or what kind of people they should be seen as, hangs thick in the air the rest of the time we spend with them. Muddied morality is a sticking point of this story, as you might can imagine. Very few, if any, characters are ever portrayed as completely binary heroes or villains, and everyone always seems to have some kind of regret or personal sin they're trying to atone for, whether it be directly or via their new paths in life, like Ed, who is simply trying to regain what he's foolishly lost after his folly, instead of seeking to repeat his mistakes with their mother, or somebody like Roy Mustang, who participated in basically genocide as a naive and loyal soldier who now seeks to bring down the regime that convinced him that it was remotely okay. The aforementioned military personnel grapple constantly with corruption in their own ranks and the kind of horrors they've been demanded to participate in, and we are constantly shown the difference between unapologetic, imperviously loyal bootlickers and the kinds of officers so scarred by the blood on their hands that they intend to tear the whole system down from within and drastically alter its course to avoid anything similar from ever happening again. Still, even these people are routinely chastised and looked upon with scorn for their part in the many personal tragedies that tear into the people affected by them, and we're never really expected to look the other way when it comes to their follies. They contain likable personality traits and qualities like just about anyone you could meet in the real world, but ultimately their track records cannot be erased, and this not only emphasizes how easily the average person can be drawn in by false promises, nationalism, and harmful rhetoric in order to become capable of previously inconceivable violence, but also the kind of complicated nature that comes with the people involved with warfare, and to what degree people would consider them personally responsible for any number of things. With this series airing in the early 2000s in America in particular, I don't think I need to tell you why this specifically touches so frankly on a topic that was on a lot of people's minds. While FMA does rather heavily lean on its World War II when portraying the horror of warfare, the fact that Amestris is rather imperialistically inclined and started a large-scale conflict of countless innocent people being killed based almost exclusively on false pretenses for the sake of personal gain, well, yeah, okay, I'm sure you get the point. Also, sorry, yeah, this is gonna get a little political. I mean, war crimes are a pretty big and prominent issue in this series, so I would hope people would know that's kind of unavoidable. But you never know with anime fans. They truly will complain that you're making things political when the very series you're talking about is incredibly political. And oh yeah, FMA is, let's just say, a wee bit political. Although, to be fair, a lot of its political themes tie more broadly into its more abstract and emotional themes, too. So it's not as if the political aspects themselves are the only primary focus of the story, even though they do inform and shape a lot of what the story is doing and saying. In fact, 2003, I would argue, has a bit more of a pessimistic view of warfare than its counterpart anyway, with a distinct feeling of melancholy and inevitability languishing overhead when these subjects come up. This is true of the way the series tends to portray violence as well, with 2009 Ed remaining steadfast and resolute basically the entire series to never kill anyone, while 2003 Ed Ed is spurred to his first kill by greed as an attempt to steel him for the road ahead, leading him to ponder whether this too is something that was unavoidable in the process of growing up. It's almost kind of funny, actually, how as my views have changed to be more optimistic and collective over the years, how I can see myself vibing much more with the 2003 series outlook when I was around the age I first got into it. Which of course isn't to imply that 2003's postulations, observations, or outlook are inherently more immature than its counterparts, or that one is objectively smarter about the world than the other, but rather that I think this brings to light an oft-overlooked contrast between the works that I think is worth exploring.
Fullmetal Alchemist. Fullmetal Alchemist.
The biggest difference in overall thematic aim, I think, can be narrowed down to some key players in the actual story, so let's start small here and work our way to the top. Somebody like Scar, for example. So, Scar is a survivor of the Ishvalan War. He has a deep-seated hatred for the state alchemists who massacred his people and starts his journey in the story as someone who goes around revenge murdering them in checklist form to avenge his people. In the process of this, however, he does often harm or otherwise negatively impact people who are not related to his revenge, and even if he weren't to, obviously murder is murder regardless of the motive, so his revenge will only spur more revenge and continue a cycle of violence, yada yada, you get the basic picture here. Now, where does this character go from here exactly? Well, 2003 Scar and his remarkably Bishonen face goes on to sort of become a bit of a rogue, recognizing that the pain he causes people will only continue to perpetuate further violence, but feeling too deep into the process to be redeemable. Scar assists the people of Lior in fighting off their own military oppression and plans to acquire the power necessary for destroying the Amestrian government by luring in a group of soldiers and creating a Philosopher's Stone with them, similarly to how his own people were exterminated solely for the sake of creating a stone. When he is begged not to do this by Alphonse, Scar shows a determination to do it for what he believes to be the greater good, having already accepted the idea that God will have turned his back on him as he is now anyway, and that if he is irredeemable, then this is all he can do to help. Through some shenanigans, he ultimately ends up doing the transmutation, but not for the sake of acquiring power, but actually to save the life of an endangered Al, who then in turn has to deal with the idea of having been saved, but at the cost of being turned into a walking cavern of human souls. In a sense, it feels almost like Scar's death here is supposed to be, in some fashion, redemptive, as if this is the only option that would have been able to redeem someone like Scar, in a sense. By contrast, 2009 Scar, in his incredibly jacked muscles on his muscles, actually accepts his place as an outcast from Ishvalan society, but in turn continues to fight for their liberation and justice through advocacy and, again, changing the system itself. He no longer murders wantonly for the sake of revenge. He's learned his lesson about how cyclical violence can become when vengeance is all that's on anyone's mind, but he also doesn't push the boundaries of anyone he's already hurt, admitting that no explanation he gives for the suffering he created could ever be good enough. Still, while he may not be considered without flaws, 2009 Scar seems to have found a kind of redemption in the eyes of most people, but by much less sacrificial means. Instead of paying the toll of his murders in his own life, he pays back to society by doing his best to improve it, and again, help shape a system that avoids creating situations like the war he was traumatized by in the first place. While it may seem idealistic, the divide that I think starts to become apparent here is that 2009, and consequently the manga, view war as something capable of ending, if only theoretically, while the 2003 series seems almost to view war as something wholly unstoppable, only navigable but not eternally avoidable. This is, of course, pushed even harder by the film Conqueror of Shambhala, which actually places Ed directly into the real world of pre-World War II Germany and actively witnessing actions taken by you-know-who, which, okay. Can I just say that this movie was weird? It was really weird, and it felt even kind of poor taste, really, to interweave a magical, mystical alchemy plot about a dragon and parallel universes with, like, actual, real historical events and real people pertaining to, Nazis. The whole other side of the gate being World War II era Our World thing was just kind of weird in general. I know a lot of people like this idea in 2003, but it just feels extremely distracting to me, and it really took me out of the otherwise pretty good final few episodes. But hey, that aside, segue. Both series seem to view the idea of government reform pretty similarly for what it's worth, although in either case, I think it's pretty Fantasyland-esque to expect the war criminals to reliably prosecute themselves, even if they do genuinely feel super guilty and responsible for the war crimes they did. But to be fair, this aspect is only ever touched on extremely briefly by either series, because by the time the government is reforming, we're basically at the very end of an extremely dense and philosophically packed story, so the process of this reformation is more the responsibility of us to imagine from there, since we're not really going to be seeing it firsthand. What we do see firsthand all throughout the series, however, are the central antagonists that shape their trajectory on conflicts. I've seen a lot of people debate on the quality of either series based nice solely around these two groups, and I think that's kind of interesting and funny, because while they certainly have their differences, I'd be inclined to say they're much more similarly natured than one might think. Well, the lead villains anyway. The homunculi are sort of a different story, but we'll be getting into them soon too. For our lead antagonists, in 2003 we have Dante, a self-important ex-lover of the brother's father, who has manipulated the homunculi over hundreds of years in order to continuously craft philosopher's stones necessary to steal younger bodies and live eternally. In 2009, we have Father, the first homunculus created by the brother's father in the ancient city of Xerxes, who longs to acquire the power of God and truth, as he originates from the curiosity of man. He creates the homunculi personally in an attempt to make himself perfect by concentrating his vices into powerful, inhuman ancillaries who do his bidding, but are also reflective of those ugly sides of him in their totality. A common criticism levied towards Father from people more inclined towards Dante are that he's shallow and his motivations amount to little more than taking over the world like a big cartoon supervillain. And I can definitely see where this impression comes from, but I think it is a bit misleading. Not to mention, I think Dante's motivations are similarly shallow, but I don't think they make her a bad character. Because in both cases, this is ultimately sort of the point. The hubris of both characters lead them in separate but similar directions and modes of thought, and I'd like to break them down both individually and a little more deeply here, starting with Dante. Dante is herself human, but the mistake of her hubris is in thinking that she's above or removable from humanity. She sees herself as someone who lives outside of regular society, as someone who looks down upon it, most likely due to the fact that she has lived several lifetimes worth of time and has seen similar conflicts repeat themselves. This sort of compounded experience and knowledge makes her feel special, like she alone understands the true nature of humanity and pities them for how sad and stupid they are, therefore enabling her to view them as nothing more than a means to an end. This is why, of course, she has no moral qualm of any sort with sacrificing hundreds, if not thousands, of people for the sake of making a philosopher's stone, but she also never wants to lose anything in the process, so she selfishly goads the homunculi into manipulating other alchemists to get their hands dirty instead. Afterwards, she just swoops in and steals it, using it to transfer her soul to a newer, younger host body to keep prolonging herself. Unfortunately for Dante, however, it's made clear that her soul is rotting from the amount it has transferred, no longer able to be maintained and withering her host bodies more and more quickly. This speaks to a sort of underlying theme of 2003 itself, which is the ideal that the immortal soul does not exist. It posits that once something is dead, it cannot come back, and that trying to escape death is a futile effort because it is an all-encompassing inevitability that takes us all. The reason why human transmutation carries such a steep punishment is because the act of trying to retrieve or transmute the soul of someone already dead is impossible, and it's hubris that enables one to think of it as something they could even manage. Human transmutation is itself a disruption of the natural cycle of life and death, and therefore it's highly punishable. Even for someone like Dante, who is convinced that she lives above humanity and alone can live forever, she cannot continue transferring to new bodies if her soul is rotting away. This is almost karmic retribution that emphasizes that Dante is not as important as she believes herself to be, that despite acting as if she lives outside of regular society, that she's no less a part of the world of humans than anyone else, and her ultimate punishment is delivered in the form of her transmutation being thwarted by a loving act of self-sacrifice, Al saving Ed, and she herself being consumed by gluttony. Subsequently, the villain of the manga in 2009, Father, is himself non-human but created by human blood. He is, in the truest sense, the first homunculus, but because he was crafted by human knowledge, he also seeks to attain all of it. In true philosopher's fashion, He manipulates countless lives into being sacrificed for the sake of his attainment of knowledge, which he likens to the truth itself, and thus God. In trying to seek the power of God, he casts his human vices off of himself in an attempt to make himself perfect, pushing farther and farther away from the conception of what makes one human in the first place. Ultimately, though, it's in disregarding the inherent power of humanity to reinvent themselves and to change that leads to his undoing, having reduced the individual lives in the Philosopher's Stones he made to nothing but a statistic, energy to be consumed, while in reality they were still individual souls with individual wills that pushed back against his own towards the very end. His fundamental misunderstanding of the human experience as something that's necessary to cast aside for the sake of truth, in reality blinds him to the very nature of truth itself, which ends in his scolding and punishment from God, who lectures him for what else? His hubris. His hubris is in believing himself to be the only person worthy to stand above humanity and attain true knowledge, when there are as many truths as there are people, reflected in the way that the truth reflects each individual silhouette back to them when they visit the gate. Ed, Al, and their many friends they've made along the way encompass many different backgrounds, beliefs, and perspectives, which all united to make the impossible possible, by making up for each other's own weaknesses. In this sense, Father has only ever isolated himself off from other people, making him stand alone, but not because of any inherent strength of character, but purely by way of his own arrogance and ignorance.
You stole your power from others. You rejected your human origins, and chose to covet the power of what you call God. You never grew beyond your days in the flask. Did you truly think you'd become superior to humans by removing your 7 desires? Don't make me laugh.
Both villains exhibit different motive origins of sorts, but they both crave the kind of eternal strength and knowledge that casting off their humanity provides for them, at least in their minds. But FMA is a story very focused in both iterations on the uniquely human nature of people as a whole. The fact that we are so complex, are so complicated, but still so beautifully have the choice to deconstruct and reconstruct ourselves in meaningful, differentiating ways, is itself something that makes our connections and bonds so important when it comes to shaping and changing the world on a broader scale. Reform is not achieved through the hands of only one person, and no one person is an island. But we are all connected, and can achieve great things with collective and unified power. One is all, and all is one, and all that. By contrast, both series' villains pervert that all-encompassing humanity in some way. Dante by selfishly seeking to break that natural cycle of life and attain control over it, willing to step over anyone and anything to achieve that, purely interested in her own selfish ends while being connected with no one. And Father by being single-mindedly obsessed with the single truth, something that in actuality doesn't and cannot exist. And to deny that nuance, that collective experience, is to shun one's own humanity entirely, and to ignorantly retreat into the comfort and false superiority of isolation. Both villains in some way also prey upon the vulnerable need of others, in different ways, but all in some way representative of their own humanity being exploited. This further incentivizes them to think of humankind in a very easily manipulated way, the product of specific variables that can be finely tuned to produce different desired results. On a more intimate scale, this can be seen in examples like Tucker in 2003, who is turned into a hideous chimera commissioned to work in the Fifth Lab to perform grotesque human experiments which benefit Dante's mission, but with the promise hanging over him of possibly creating a doll-like replica of the daughter he selfishly sacrificed before. While on the broader scale, this could apply to the entire military state of Amestris itself, relentless in its drive to expand its territory and more than willing to commit underhanded atrocities to do so, often already being on the verge of it themselves before either antagonist gives them a small push to get the gears turning. In both series cases, this results in the creation of a Philosopher's Stone, which forms the basis of their motive for war, similar to how other real-life nations will create a false precedent for conflict when in actuality their motive is almost purely material. It stands out then that a Philosopher's Stone is comprised of human life, reducing them to pure energy and exhausting them as a resource, kind of like workers being driven by the state into worse and worse conditions, having their labor exploited, and ultimately being reduced to an object in the eyes of those who were supposed to be their benefactors. The support and ignorance of the public is either earned by rhetoric or philosophical buzzwords, survival of the fittest or things like that, invocations of some sort of human nature that allow them to turn their brains off and ignore what's happening and how it really isn't so natural when you think about it. This brings us back to the principle of equivalent exchange, which is supposed to be the core tenet of alchemy, but ultimately becomes sort of an ideological catch-all for how the world functions within the Amestrian state. This ignores the fact that it doesn't really apply to everything, and in many cases, it's flat out the opposite of true. It's a good way to materially dismiss the complaints of those people who have it worse than you by simply saying, everyone gets what they put in, but that's to ignore the many examples of that not holding up against scrutiny. People who get transmuted into Philosopher's Stones, for example, what do they get equally in return? They get exhausted until they basically get their souls drained like batteries? Sounds more like torture than equivalency.
Do you sincerely believe that your single life is equivalent to the remaining multitude of your followers? Your stature has gone to your head. The life of any individual human is only worth one life. That's all. Nothing more and nothing less.
It's this self-awareness of the inherent imbalance created by these beliefs, buzzwords, and catch-alls that forms a sort of really solid picture of what exactly the antagonistic forces in FMA stand for, and they mirror so many real-life problems we face that it becomes easy to root against them in sharp contrast to our much more grounded, flawed, but human lead characters. The brothers who have transgressed upon the cycle of life as ignorant children now stare down the grown, cynical, and cyclical exploitation of people knowingly making their mistakes over and over again, and trying to trick other people into being okay with it. And there's power in trying to stop that, and in the process materially improve people's lives. There's power in valuing our shared human experience, and every bit, ugly or beautiful, of that. Of course, like I said, the conclusions of this realization are somewhat tonally different between both series. 2003 seems to go more by the principle of the second law of thermodynamics, or entropy, the idea that you'll basically always lose more than you gain. By consequence, FMA 2003 is more a narrative about finding a means of acceptance and forging your own path of happiness despite what life ends up inevitably taking from you. That even if you suffer, go through hardship, or indeed even warfare, that if you are alive, you will always have the chance to find something worth living for. By contrast, 2009 and the manga have Ed and Al beginning to propose the inklings of a new theory by the end of the series, that true equivalency is receiving, giving back, and then adding something of yourself as well.
We've been treated so well. So many people have cared for both of us. And now, for all this compassion, we feel like it's our turn to repay the happiness that's been given to us.
Isn't that like what the alchemists believe? Equivalent exchange?
No, it's equivalent if you take 10 and then you give 10 back. But if you take 10 and then you add something of yourself, you return 11.
This too challenges the binary view of equivalency by insisting that we act cooperatively to achieve our ends, rather than simply for self-interest. It denies the basis that everything in the world need purely be transactional, and instead believes more in the inherent ability of humanity to do good, which is itself a very culturally Japanese way of thinking. You see, we Americans are more predisposed to think of humanity as inherently cruel, selfish, or violent, or what have you, seeking redemption through knowledge and action. Whereas the Japanese tend to view humans by default as more purely good creatures, darkened in our nature by whichever outside influences we happen to be subjected to, thus dictating the degree of which we end up becoming a cruel person. Indeed, motive in this sense plays a key part of a lot of backstories in FMA, which itself informs the kind of transformation of self these people have been led through, despite all starting in a good state. This might then explain the true callousness of the homunculi as depicted by the manga and 2009 canons, as they essentially embody these darknesses, never having started without stain, and thus being subject to the whim of their own selfishness. They work single-mindedly for their own goals because, in lacking the spark of humanity and having no want for it in the first place, they operate purely on self-interest, never having the human need to care and be cared for by other people. Of course, this is also what makes the homunculi of 2003 so interesting to me, seeing as instead of embodied vices, they're actually the result of all failed human transmutations, powered by Philosopher's Stones. They are essentially inhuman husks, many of whom long to complete themselves by becoming human, and also to assert their own individual will, to escape the confines of who they were made to be and become who they want to be. This, in a sense, also underlies the arrogance of those who would break the natural cycle of life in order to bring them into creation, only to then regret their decision and take that life back from a creature who never asked to be born as they were in the first place. In particular, the scene where Ed and Al fight Sloth, who was made from their mother, really sticks out to me in this respect, as she admits that part of her feels capable of loving the boys, but it's this feeling that ties her to the woman she was based on, and her hope is to sever that tie by being capable of killing them, something their mother would never do. As an aside, though, I do kind of wonder what would happen if there were more than 7 of them at the same time, since they're literally not embodiments of the 7 deadly sins. Would their naming scheme get screwed up? If just one more dumbass alchemist in the world decided to try bringing their dentist back to life or something? Maybe they choose from the list of 7 sins, like a class system? Like, if you're a homunculus, you get swept by this weird sewer cult up in your infant abomination state, and they feed you bloody rock candy, and then you get told to pick your allegiance like you're some kind of Dark Souls character. Come to think of it, there's a lot of imagery in FMA that reminds me of Dark Souls or Bloodborne. Okay, I'm getting off track here. It's this intricate web of conspiracy, humanity, heart, and conviction that makes either plot of FMA stand very clearly on its own despite their differing viewpoints, because their central heart gets at a lot of the same points, even if it doesn't handle them quite the same way. This nuance makes the storytelling very grounded and real, as if we are also on this journey of discovery and reconciliation with the brothers, coming to understand the world in our own unique ways alongside them. And I think this touched on something deep for a lot of people growing up, because this may have been the first time some of us ever truly thought about these things. I watched FMA 2003 when I was about 10 or 11 years old, and you can bet that these subjects had never really breached my periphery until then. And I think that's bound to strike a chord with someone when they consider it for the first time. These ponderances make you consider your own humanity in a way more tangible manner and in perspective to your own surroundings. It was the first time that while I was having fun watching an anime, it also made me feel like I was beginning to understand some deeper philosophical value of the human experience. What didn't make me feel like that was Conqueror of Shambhala, though. Frankly, when I was a kid, I didn't really get it. Thought it was pretty boring. Now I get it, but boy, is it sloppy. It really just doesn't add that much of any substance to the television ending of 2003, and what it does add is often so heavy-handed and clumsily handled that it just brings the experience down. The villain in particular just blasts meaningless platitudes about dehumanization and war without really meaningfully reflecting those views as much as she just states them, like some kind of cartoon Nazi, which she is. Apparently, like 80% of this film was left on the cutting room floor due to lack of time and production restraint, though. So I can definitely see where maybe some of the better ideas could have themselves been fleshed out more thoroughly in, say, a 13-episode anime season, which Shambhala was originally pitched as. But this was 2005, and 2009 was only 4 years off, so suffice it to say, Bones wasn't really interested in dumping more money into an anime original continuation of a manga that might be over within a few years tops. Their focus was more on getting ready for the production of said manga-faithful adaptation, and while I do think it's a shame that Shambhala didn't see a fully formed vision closer to what the director was going for, I'm also not sure I would have preferred that come out if it meant we never got a second anime. Because to me, more Fullmetal Alchemist is nearly always a good thing. Nearly always. This is also where I should probably dip into the production side of things where anime is considered, because boy howdy, both series are beautifully animated by Bones, who pulled out some of the best work in the business for 2009's action sequences in particular, especially given the high volume of them. 2003 is of course older and a bit stiffer in its movement, but overall still contains some extremely solid direction and some pretty standout sequences across its 51-episode run. In particular, I think the differing aesthetics of each series also highlight their own thematic similarities but differences, with 2003 often sporting dimmer or more washed color palettes, Ed's coat being less of a blaring loud red and more of a crimson or blood-colored piece. By contrast, 2009 is a bit more rounded and similar to the aesthetic of Arakawa's late manga, often drawing the eye with a lot of sharp and loud color decisions, which work to create a similar sense of contrast as the manga artwork does at its best. I do, however, think the direction suffers a bit when it's first getting off the ground, and even still more in conversational scenes. A lot of it is very one-to-one with the original manga paneling, and this can often lead to scenes feeling a bit static or lifeless, especially in the early episodes. But this obviously becomes mitigated more along the way, particularly with the creative action choreography that comes more and more into play throughout the series. Indeed, I would unfortunately have to say that the 2009 series has the weaker start compared to its 2003 counterpart, but I would argue for understandable reasons. You see, since this was less than a decade after the last television adaptation, Bones was right to assume that most people had already seen and had pretty good memory of the original 2003 series. And so, the first 14 to 15-ish odd episodes of 2009 are more or less catch-up to the manga original stuff they didn't get to adapt the first time around. This leads to the overall pace and presentation of the first arc or so feeling generally a bit rushed, and a bit comparatively lackluster because of it, although once you get over that hump, it drastically improves. Unfortunately, I couldn't really recommend you simply watch the relevant material in 2003 and then switch over, because by that time 2003 has already interwoven so many small but crucial plot differences specific to its own story, that the switch would ultimately confuse you too much to probably keep following. Which is why, for the ultimate cumulative experience, I basically just recommend people watch FMA the way all of us old fans did. 2003 first, 2009 second, both fully, Shambhala optionally between them. You'll be able to appreciate the different tone and story of each while being informed enough to follow when 2009 gets a bit shorthand. Or you could just read the manga, which I actually do recommend you do, even if you've seen both anime. The experience is ultimately a lot more cohesive than any adaptation in terms of presenting Arakawa's vision from beginning to end, and there are a lot of little tidbits that you'd just miss out on anywhere else, especially with things like the special epilogue chapter. If you only read the manga, though, you'd miss out on some seriously great sound work. The scores of both series are breathtaking work. Each deserve their place in anime history with gold stars attached to their names. The 2003 score is often more somber and wistful, with one of its most iconic tracks, Bracha, being nearly synonymous with the franchise to this day. Meanwhile, 2009 also carries some powerful presence with it. Instrumentation bombastic and full, like military ensembles, further emphasizing the humble climb downward with more introspective pieces like Edward's theme. At the end of the day, I think all of these reasons, and many others, are why FMA has endured so long past its original conception. Its stories, its themes, and its postulations are also uniquely timeless. Its fantastical world mixed with the history of our own, bringing to mind both the familiar and the outlandish. It transmutes the very best of escapist fantasy, but also somber reality, into a perfect blend of action, intrigue, levity, introspection, grief, trauma, heart, and hope. Whether it's the hope to push past the worst the world has handed us, or the determination to change that world for the better through our connections with others. Fullmetal Alchemist understands what it means to be human, and ultimately that being human is what connects all of us. It's never simply enough to cross our arms, stand at the sidelines, and deride others for their participation in society. It's not our job to become some self-appointed logician who seeks to undermine any truth we deem irrelevant in a cold, factual sense. For we who live in this world, it is our job to participate in it, value the people living in it with us, so that we can all climb down from the seats of philosophers and live as humans, thoughtful, flawed, and beautiful in all the ways that make us ourselves. In the very end of the FMA manga, Ed does regain what he and Al have lost of themselves by sacrificing his own gate of truth, his position as an alchemist and thus a philosopher of the world, humbling himself before truth. When it asks him if he would really rather lower himself to the level of a normal human, he responds that he was never anything more than that in the first place, and that no cold pursuit of knowledge, no statistics or facts, formulas or theories could ever trump the most important thing of all, his connections to others who love him. And it responds that he is correct. And that's why I love Fullmetal Alchemist. I think that's why a lot of people love Fullmetal Alchemist. It entertained us, true, but it also made us think, many of us for the first time in our young lives. It taught us about the cruelty of the world around us and the cynicism that often drives it, but also of the ways in which we can survive it and even make it better with help. It taught us that as long as we never stopped thinking, as long as we never just accepted a single truth and took it for granted, that we would always be better off than a stubborn sycophant lauding themselves in their ivory tower. We can make a difference. We can help people. And it's these considerations and explorations of these very human ideals that FMA made possible, navigable, through the use of its engaging story, world, and uniquely charming characters. Fullmetal Alchemist is my favorite story ever told. And 20 years later, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Hey everybody, thanks for watching my video on Fullmetal Alchemist. I've been wanting to talk about it for a very long time, so I'm glad I finally got to do that. If you like my videos, then please consider leaving a comment or subscribing, as it really endears me to the ever-abrasive YouTube algorithm that hates when I get inactive. I also have a Patreon that you can support if you want to further support the creation of my videos and you want to make my living situation just a little bit more tolerable. And with that all being said, thank you so much for watching, everybody. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.